Hello, welcome to financial training. We are from the Legislative Fiscal Division, and we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Susie Lindsay. I'm the lead analyst here. And with me today is Quinn Holzer.
Hello, I'm Quinn Holzer. I'm Assistant Director here in the Legislative Fiscal Division, and we're going to hit a lot of kind of very high-level concepts today. We're not going to give you a ton of detail, but this hopefully would help you just get the baseline understanding for our state budget. Then if you have any questions, feel free to come to anyone in the Legislative Fiscal Division. One thing I will point out is that in the Fiscal Division, we have gold name tags that are rectangular in shape, so you can identify us. So please find us and ask any questions that you might have. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share, and we will start into a PowerPoint here. All right, we're just going to kind of kick it off by going into some very basics of state finance and understanding what happens. First off, I think it's fairly straightforward that state government collects revenues, and of course that is based on laws that the legislature has established, but those get addressed less often than appropriations. In the middle there, you see the appropriations, and every session the legislature grants permission to spend through appropriations. And then it's the state government again that spends those funds. So those expenditures are made, but no funds can be spent without authorization of the legislature. So we've got a lot of things going on in statute actually, and it actually defines government accounting. And there's a variety of ways that funding is dealt with in statute. House Bill 2 will be the primary thing that you will see in legislative session as to how the appropriations and the budget is established for state agencies. But then there are other appropriations that are established in statute, and those are referred to as statutory, and other bills can include appropriations as they go through. So House Bill 2 is the primary tool, but definitely not the only tool for spending authorized during session. There is statute, MCA 17-8-101, you'll see referenced here a few times, that goes into a little bit of detail as to other types of budgets that are established and fit different categories here. So the primary category that we'll be dealing with, or you as a legislator will be dealing with, is governmental funds. And those primarily in House Bill 2, but also the statutories and a little bit of other things we'll go into in a second. But there are also proprietary, fiduciary, and university funding sources that you deal with less. The proprietary things, I'm going to just go ahead and skip to the next slide so we can see some examples of each of those. I'll work backwards on this just because we'll end on the governmental ones and go into this a little more. But you can see on the right there the university funds, and they have what they call current unrestricted and some funds. There is a differentiation between the control the legislature has over providing funding and the control the university system has over running their own things. And so constitutionally, they do have a control over their own system. And so there is a separation there. Then in the fiduciary category there, you can see where things like pensions and trusts fall. The pension system is established, and it's established in statute, but then the state has a fiduciary responsibility to deal with those. And those funding systems are not dealt with in House Bill 2, et cetera. Or excuse me, the expenditures out of those. Then you can see proprietary. I think the simplest way to explain proprietary would to say it's like a business in that way. An agency actually charges for a service, and that can be charging for others out in the state to pay for their service, like applying for a permit or something like that, or it can be internally, and it's how we do cost allocation type things. It can be within an agency or from one agency to another. But governmental, again, we're going to focus on governmental funds here today. You've got general fund, state funds, federal funds. You've got some other smaller things in there, but as you'll see, those first three are the primary things that we'll deal with in establishing appropriations through the legislature. These are not hard and fast percentages, but this gives you a general idea of kind of the scope and size of some different sources of the accounting groups here. Governmental funds are just about 60% here, proprietary 8%, fiduciary 22%, university funds at 11% here. Again, we're going to kind of talk about these as we go forward. And again, these are not hard and fast percentages, not going to be true every session, but it gives you kind of an idea of the scope of where these funds lie. Within those, you can break them down further. And in the governmental funds, you'll see that general fund, state special, and federal, the general fund and federal each make up about a third of those governmental funds, and the state special being a little less there. But those are the primary things that we'll deal with in House Bill 2. If you were to look at House Bill 2, you'll see those as categories of funding in there along with proprietary, but those are the primary sources that you'll deal with as we go into this. Now, the reality is general fund ends up being the focus of the legislature, and there's a variety of reasons for that as well. First off, that is where the legislature balances revenues and expenditures. And so if anything is going to be done on the revenue side, adjusting tax rates, those kinds of things, then that has to be taken into consideration on the expenditure side as well. General fund comes into a general source of revenue with no specific purpose. And so there's a lot of competing interests for that funding. And so, when things are proposed, they are competing with other big ideas or existing programs in order to get funding out of the general fund. It really is a key component for us in how we evaluate the fiscal health of the state. And Susie does a lot of that work during the session, and we do a lot of reporting on that and making sure that we are monitoring and tracking the status of the general fund throughout every biennium. So where do we go with the general fund? We kind of joke sometimes that the primary things with general fund is that we use it to educate, medicate, and incarcerate. These are, we break down House Bill 2 into sections. And so sections A through E, you can see that section E deals with education, section B deals with health and human services, and section D with public safety. And so that's kind of the primary areas you would see those three large areas of general fund expenditure. Obviously in education, you've got K-12 and the university system, as well as other things. Section B, Medicaid is a huge part of that. Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, but there's a lot of other programs in there, TANF, SNAP, different things that are also funded through Section B. And then in Section D, you can see the public safety stuff. And this is everything from, the local police type systems to what happens in the judicial system, both from the, Department of Justice and the judicial branch, but also from the Office of the Public Defender. And so there are multiple aspects from which this is all dealt with before we finally get to the Department of Corrections and things like that. So that incarcerate category holds a lot of public safety types of things. But by no means is that everything. You'll see sections A and C there. Section A is general government. And there's actually a much larger component of general fund that goes through that than you might think. A lot of that is transfers to local governments, though. So when you see a large general fund expenditure through Section A, don't forget that there's a lot of that goes to local governments and pension systems. So by no means is it not used for anything other than to educate, medicate, and incarcerate. And Section C is natural resources. A lot of times natural resources does not have a lot of general fund, but is instead funded by, fees or, I'll show you some examples here in a little while, but one of the things that we talk about, like with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, is the general license account. And so that's, again, a state special fund that they have that is funded by fees. So moving toward those state and special and federal special funds, then I mentioned the general license fund for fish and wildlife and fish and game activities. Sometimes people assume that then there's a lot less pressure or restrictions on spending. But the reality is when you increase the spending for fish and wildlife, it's going to, expend those revenues more quickly. And if the only source of revenues for that is, fish and licenses, then they will have to raise the cost of those licenses. And that can be complicated and political and have ramifications and bring a lot of people out into the session to speak to that. So it may not have the same competition for general fund with other areas, but there will be people watching because it will impact their budget and their decisions. And as a hunter or a fisherman, then that if more is approved in that area, it's more likely that your license fees will go up in the future. Same thing with things like gas tax. Traditionally, gas taxes have been used to pay for highways and leverage then, and we'll talk about this on the other side on the federal funds as well. But those gas taxes have traditionally been used to support a highway system in Montana. So which moves us into that federal special revenue fund a little bit. I'll start with the The gas tax is there just because we've been talking about that. Federal system does provide a lot of dollars to this state for transportation and infrastructure there. And we have to match that. And so we use the gas taxes to leverage to bring in more federal money. And so you can see that federal money is an important source for us, but oftentimes we're leveraging it with another source of funding. And that is true both of these examples where you have federal highway dollars, as well as in health and human services, where we leverage matching funds locally to get Medicaid and children's health insurance monies from the federal government to pay for health programs. And so in that case, with the Medicaid and children's health insurance program, we are using both general fund and state special to leverage and get federal money, but they all become important when we're looking at these types of programs. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Susie to kind of talk through a little bit of some of the complexities of how we measure our funding.
Thanks, Gwen. Yes. So the Legislative Fiscal Division reports out in a variety of ways. Some of our more common reporting that you will hear about is state resources. State resources is defined in statute in 177150, and basically the biggest section of that rule is to remove duplicate transfers. So when you hear about state resources reporting, that's just simply following a statute of how we report out. Again, as Quinn mentioned, we often report on general fund, and in the next slide, we can see that this is a view of the 2025 biennium general fund budget in its total. This is the budget that runs through June 30th, 2025. And you can see that it's just about 5.7 billion. And a good portion of that is House Bill 2. And you can also see on this slide in small letters that it has the 177150 designation down at the bottom, so that this is a reporting of state resources, but general fund only. And so general fund funds both House Bill 2 and statutory appropriations. Those are appropriations that are made in statute by the legislature and do not get reviewed on an biennial basis, but are things like the pension systems or debt service. If the state has any debt, they have to pay, or in terms of like federal dollars, we can talk about that more later when we see that chart, but those are statutory appropriations. Other appropriation bills are things like the legislature, you as a legislator might come and have an idea for a bill, and it's a new idea, and it does have a cost involved, and the legislature chooses to adopt that idea, but then they appropriate funding to cover the costs that would be associated with a new policy or new idea. That's generally what those other appropriation bills are. They can also be infrastructure bills. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about where the revenues come from that funds some of these. So on the left, we are talking about general revenues. Now, general revenues is not the same thing as general fund revenue. And this is another way that we report out. General revenues is actually defined in statute also, and it includes all of general fund revenue, plus it includes the school equalization payments. So when you, as a taxpayer, pay property taxes for schools, and we call this the school equalization payment or the 95 mills, this is included in this general revenues pie chart. Also included in there is the interest earnings on short-term interest rates that are temporarily going to a state special fund, but they are included as a general revenue definition. They will be, as of 2026, those will no longer be included in that general revenues definition. They'll still be in the definition, but they'll go back to the general fund. So these are just different ways we report, but you can see that the general revenues, 57% comes from individual income tax payers. So when you pay your individual income tax, that is the biggest source of funding for general revenues for the state. On the right side, you can see that we also get revenues from other sources, like Quinn was mentioning, state special funding when you pay a fee for hunting, say, for example, that's a revenue that comes in as state special. And again, the federal special funding, a lot of that is our transportation and Medicaid healthcare from the federal government that comes to the state. And now the next slide shows the total 25 biennium budget with all the funds included. So you can see that total budget was about $19.3 billion. And this budget runs through June 30th, 2025. You can see that the overwhelming majority of the funding and is House Bill 2 at, between House Bill 2 and the House Bill 2 language appropriations, it's 74.8%. And then again, the statutory appropriations are the next largest slice of that at about 15%, 14.5%. And again, some federal statutory appropriations are like the Indian Health Service. That is a statutory appropriation on the federal side. And again, on the general fund side, much of that is payments to local governments and state pensions. And then again, those other appropriation bills, 10.8% this time for this current budget. And those again are typically infrastructure bills and other ideas that legislators bring, and they fund, they appropriate, and those would be new ideas, new policy choices, that kind of thing. On the next slide, we want to talk to you about how you can find a lot of the information that we provide, because like I said, we provide a lot of reports. This is the link on the left, legmt.gov/LFD is our web page, our home site, and this is what it looks like. And at the top, you can see there's a policy and fiscal libraries link, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then underneath there's some other choices that you might be interested in looking at. If you're interested in the budget, so House Bill 2, in revenues, our office also estimates the general fund revenues as well as other funds. That would be found under that button. We also have budget committees that if you want to watch, the decisions being made in the budget committees during session and during the interim, those would be found under that button. And we've built a lot of interactive tools that are data driven. And our office has a group of people that just focus on data, and they find data, they put it together and provide a wide range of interactive tools. And I'll also touch on that in a minute. But if you were to click on the policy and fiscal libraries button on the next slide, you can see how that page looks. And that page has a variety of topics, and these were put together by both the policy arm of the legislative staff and the fiscal staff. So we have, you as legislators have a whole staff of researchers and attorneys that that write your policy bills that you request and help you through the process of those during session and during the interim. And then we, as the fiscal division, are the fiscal staff that talk about the money side of it. And so all the staff got together and curated different topics that we think are of interest to you as a legislator. And so you can choose any of the topics on the far right bar, and you can see, you know, behavioral health, childcare, criminal justice, energy, housing, school funding. They're all topics that you might want to dig deeper into. Now, if you were to click on the school funding, the next slide will show you what that page looks like. So the school funding has a data interactive tool at the top, because school funding is very complicated. It has 6 pages in this data tool that you can go through and really just dive very deep into how funding for schools is done in Montana. And then underneath the accordions that say school funding basics, litigation background, and historical materials, and the property tax library, all of those are connected. If you open those accordions, you'll see policy reports and various different other publications that are focused on K-12 education in Montana. And the property tax library is another data tool because much of the funding for K-12 is derived from property taxes. So that's just one example, and you have experts in your nonpartisan staff that can answer questions for you. The next slide just talks about any questions you might have and how to get a hold of both Gwen or I. We are always happy to answer your questions, and you can either find us in our offices or, you know, on Teams. If you're a legislator, you can, you know, chat with us anytime on Teams, or just walk down and meet with us or email us. Easy. So thank you for joining us today.